Welcome, people. Welcome back to our series here on Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history.
Yes, welcome back to the nature of the state. The state and the actualization of freedom.
Yes, the topic of today is going to be the state.
Yeah, and how is the proper place where freedom is actualized, right? Where we can only be truly free is the state.
Surprisingly enough, yes, and we shall have to see. That's going to probably rub a few noses and other organs the wrong way. But let's see what Hegel has to say about that and why that might be the case.
Yeah. So maybe it's worth recapping one small point that I think we made an episode or two ago about the ethical life. And Hegel opens the section with this sort of recap. He says this ethical life is the unity of the two extremes, the idea of freedom and human passions, which we discussed in the previous episode. The state is the midpoint of these two aspects, which also come to the fore in it. I mean, it's not worth, we shouldn't go, we don't have to completely summarize what we talked about, but the idea is that what is the idea of freedom? The idea of freedom is us coming to comprehend our own rationality, very briefly put. And
well, it's yeah, sure, but it's not just a form of knowing, right? It's also a form of being.
It's a form,
yeah,
and being
just
in that
knowing you're free, you're just a silly stoic. But you want to live, freely as well, right?
Yeah,
and
you want to. Yeah, good. Yeah, and the human passions. What does Hegel call it? That colorful din of humanity.
Yeah. Well, it's I suppose you have the idea of freedom kind of covers the most mediated aspects of our lives or existence, and whereas human passions cover the most immediate aspects of our lives.
Right.
Passion's usually something that bumps into us, or we feel immediately. It's a given, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't really control what you feel, at least not directly. You have to manipulate it indirectly.
Right. Whereas freedom involves an activity on our part of comprehending, of knowing and willing our freedom.
Yes, I think that's right.
And that's why it's mediated.
Yeah.
Something that we work through to get. We don't just get it at the beginning. We're not free when we're animals in the wild. We work through it in our rationality.
Yeah, I think this working through is an important part of freedom for Hegel. It isn't just something, you cannot give freedom to someone. They have to make it for themselves. They have to create their own freedom. It's just as people create their own careers, just destiny, skill set, right, relationships, and so forth.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I think that kind of summarizes the ethical life, so the ethical life is the unity of these two things. So it's the merging, it's the mediation of what makes us individual, our individual passions, our individual characters, with our knowledge of freedom. And it's the willing, it's how we will ourselves to be through this unity. We don't just act according to our passions. We don't act devoid of passions either, or we could, I suppose, but that wouldn't be properly ethical. I don't know what that would be like. Maybe like a hyper-rationalist, like a AI.
Or just like a boring bureaucracy. You just do the job, but you have no feeling for it. And so it's completely uninspiring.
Yeah, kind of Kafkaesque world, right, where you just got a bunch of admins, just gray. That's how I imagine Kafka's worlds, just gray colored.
Yeah, although I think I don't think strictly speaking for Hegel on a technical level, just wouldn't be any form of action.
Right. Okay.
I think you have these experiments with mice where they give them everything they need, or they drug them or something like that.
Yeah.
And once you have the cocaine, you're like, why even move? Why do anything? You're just in perfect bliss, right?
Are you comparing cocaine to the idea of freedom?
as a negative to it, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that's, yeah, go on.
Yeah, well, you just said ethical life, and well, strictly speaking, Hegel writes ethical whole is the unity,
Right.
whereas ethical life constitutes the midpoint in which freedom objectifies itself. So a little bit of a different emphasis there, I think.
Right, yeah.
But it's roughly ballpark the same idea.
Okay. So would the ethical whole be a more impersonal thing, like the state, and ethical life would be the individuals of the state?
No, I think maybe ethical whole is much kind of covers the wider spectrum of objective spirit.
Okay.
Whereas ethical life specifically homes in on family, civil society, and the state. I think that's ethical life proper, explicit. Whereas maybe you can say, in a fuzzy way, morality is part of the ethical whole. Right is part of the ethical whole, because at the end of the day, these things are grounded in the ethical life, right?
Okay, I see. All right. So,
as we said, the state is the midpoint, right? Or where this is taking place, or like not the midpoint, but where freedom is objectified.
Right. And why is freedom is objectified? Because it's something that's external to us, and we imbue it with the idea of freedom. Is that why it's objectified?
Is it just a question of externality?
I've always understood the sphere. I think externality. I think there is something with externality. Yes. The fact that it's external relations, so relations between people, or relations between people and institutions, or between institutions, that seems to be what distinguishes objective spirit from subjective spirit, for example, in the philosophy of spirit.
Yes.
In the third part of the encyclopedia.
Yeah.
But it's not like nature, because it's got the activity of reason in it. It's not, as Alison Stone calls nature, petrified. It's the embodiment of our expression of the idea of freedom in these various ethical moments, in rights, in property, in family, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that we need to be careful here with the term idea, or as you put it, idea of freedom, because that can easily kind of slide into a subjective thinking that, the objective freedom, or like objective spirit, or the state is just whatever people think the state is, and that is just what is going to be. It seems like for Hegel, the criteria is much stronger, and in the sense that this thing has a kind of logic of its own, almost lifelike, right? That we take part in, right? And it embodies certain values we might have and so forth. But in no way is it, one-to-one equal with what we think it is, even though we're not completely blind to what is happening to it, because people are theorizing about the state, and there's politicians and so on and so forth. But the fact that it has a logic of its own, I think, what gives its kind of objective credence. And in objective, I nest your term, the way you put external, right? So it has to be external, but not just external, because that would just make it natural and mechanic, right? No, it's kind of fused with spiritual intentions, right? There is that involved as well. People have incentives, drives, and so on and so forth.
That's a good way of putting it, yeah. And this is what Hegel is concerned with, right? That people have misunderstood the conception of the state. So he gives a very, I think, possibly even a very contemporary idea of what the state is, which is, to quote Hegel, it's a collection of human beings in which the freedom of all is limited, and that therefore the state is the negation of freedom in such a way that for individuals only a small area remains free.
But that is the representation he's critiquing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to say. That this is what people think the state is.
Right. Of course.
Hegel, I assume he's maybe thinking of Hobbes here, who thinks of these exchanges, or maybe Rousseau, the idea of the social contract.
I don't think he's thinking of Hobbes, because I don't think Hobbes has that. Hobbes is actually more closer to Hegel, I think.
You don't think Hobbes thinks that we exchange our natural freedom for a kind of lesser freedom in the state?
Nope.
Ah, okay.
I think we achieve freedom in the state, not outside of it. I think Hegel is, or Hobbes is closer, or Hegel is closer to Hobbes, in that we have this imagination that we are free outside of the state, okay. But actually we're objectively not.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there's a good paper there about Hegel and Hobbes, because I think most people read Hobbes the other way, no?
Well, when I was reading Leviathan, that's how it seemed to me. But maybe that's my Hegelian bias shining through.
No. Okay, so maybe someone like Rousseau then, something like a social contract theorist, someone who thinks
in that vein,
yeah, someone who thinks that we had way more freedom before, but we're sort of giving it up in the state.
Yeah, and
we have what we can do is very limited.
Yeah, like a goddamn hippie. Like, oh, everything was nice and good in the nature, and people could do what they wanted and screw around. Like, nope, the state of nature is dreadful. Living in constant fear and war and tension and war.
Right. According to Rousseau, of course. Well, according to Hobbes.
Yes. But for Rousseau, it was,
paradise.
Yeah, it's paradise.
Yeah. Okay, so Hegel wants to go against this. He doesn't think that it's right to think of the state as the limitation of freedom.
No, certainly not.
Instead, he wants to think that it's in the state that individuals are finally able to properly actualize their freedom.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess the first question then is, why? Why does Hegel think that?
Well, for one thing, what he talks about is that he puts this emphasis on objective being that you get from being part of the states, and that you wouldn't able to kind of engender this objective being purely out of yourself. It is in and through others in an organized way that you are able to get this objective sense of yourself. So in a way, you can think of even, I don't know, professions or various mandates, right? They have their value and authority and credence because of the relationships and network they form part of.
Right.
And I suppose that civil society is nested within this, right? Where you have goods and services being traded and so on. But something has to kind of guarantee or vouch for things going according to a certain order, right? That people don't cheat each other, commit fraud, steal, etc., because nobody really likes that, because that is precisely denigrating the universal. And the state is all about embodying the universal, which Hegel thinks is kind of part of the idea of freedom.
Yeah. And
so you as an individual are able to gain objective being through participating in this organizational structure of the state, I think, and all that it comes with, right? You follow the laws, you pay your taxes, blah blah blah, you participate in society and so on, and then you gain skills or you gain a mandate or whatever, and the people will recognize you based on those things.
And I think it's important to emphasize that on a conceptual level, there is what the relation is, because you might think conceptually that it's a purely external relation, that we've created the state and it's there outside of us and we're trying to live through it.
Yeah, yeah, he makes this distinction between people and government.
Right, yeah, exactly. And I think on a conceptual level, it's important to remember that for Hegel, as you said earlier, actually, that the state has its own logic, its own rationality, that rationality in the state is what connects us to it, is what makes it, is what brings us, is what makes us part of the ethical whole together.
Mm-hmm.
We're not sort of added, we're not appendages onto it, and nor is the state something that is sort of there and we then sort of use it as if it were a tool.
Yeah.
But we're part of the same thing.
Yeah.
So when we're engaging with laws, when we're engaging in whatever, in all the things that we do in the state, we're not engaging with alien, external, foreign objects, but we're engaging with things that are fundamentally identical to us, or in a relation with us.
Yeah, it's a form of organizations of which we are members. There are many different forms of organizations of which we can be members of. Hegel names like the family, right? But he thinks that what distinguishes these various organizations with members is how they're, connecting the members to the whole. And the way that you are connected to your family, Hegel thinks, is through love, right? Which is something that's largely given, something largely immediate, even though for the parents, it's a labor of love,
literally,
right? Yeah. Whereas for the kids, it's kind of nourishes them and helps them develop and grow.
Yeah.
And Hegel thinks that that's the rational way, that it's the way it has to be. But that becomes a perversion if we export that logic exactly over into the state.
Because and that's pretty interesting, actually. Yeah. Because you get a little snippet into what Hegel might say, for example, to a certain perverse form of nationalism, maybe, which sort of maybe borders on the erotic. I'm sounding like a French philosopher now.
Yeah, you sound like Bataille.
But I mean, he says, for example, the state is a willed and known unity. It is spirit, not in the form of love or sentiment, but rather in the form of willing and knowing the universal. And as you correctly said, Hegel finds something false, something wrong about your relation with the state being one of love, of, and I'm thinking of these kinds of, I don't know if anyone's ever described nationalism as a kind of, or extreme nationalism as a kind of love, but
certainly a lot of sentiment.
A lot of sentiment, we might say. Yeah. And Hegel wants to emphasize that it's not about that, it's about willing and knowing the universal. And
yes, although he does make some room for what he calls Volkgeist, right? So a kind of sense of communion people have with one another. So there is room for a little bit of sentiment there.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
That's not part of the universal.
Well, it's not part of the state as such, because the state is meant to express the universal, right?
Yeah. So something that we've been hinting at is a really famous idea that Hegel, he's not the first one to suggest it, but he defends it. This idea of the state as an organic unity.
Right.
So it's not like mechanical parts. There isn't this sheer externality between individuals or between individuals and institutions, nor is it a teleological structure. So we're not using the state for an end that we have, nor is the state using us for its end, whatever that would look like. But the state is the end and the means, and we are members of it the same way organs and arms are members of an organism. They're sort of distinguished aspects of the organism, but you have to take them as a whole, or at least Hegel would argue you have to take them as a whole.
Right.
And that's how he conceives of the state. So you can pick out individual moments. There are obviously individual citizens, but there's also the whole, there's also the organism. And that is what the state is, in this sort of, in a conceptual schema. Hegel is very much drawing on, I guess, the logic of life in the science of logic.
Right.
In the chapter on the idea.
Yeah. No, certainly it's not a kind of one-sided teleology. I think there is still teleology involved because life itself forms kind of teleology. It's just that the teleology is kind of reciprocal, right? It's both ends and means at once, right? The arrow of causality kind of goes both ways.
It's inner purposiveness. It's that kind of teleology.
Yeah.
Obviously, I mean, this is the very nice sort of layered aspect of Hegel's philosophy. Obviously, individuals in the state might behave as if it's there for external teleological reasons. So, people engaged in trade, let's say, might view the state as a means for them to make profit. But that needs to be in line with the universal. It needs to be, it needs to fall under what the universal essence of the state is. Otherwise, it would be sort of in tension with the state.
Yes, I think that's right. Although, I mean, the way you speak now is kind of like from an ideal perspective. Ideally,
of course,
right? That's how it ought to be and needs to be. But there are certainly lots of, I don't know, corrupt officials, politicians, civil servants, etc., seeing the state as an means to some end or for their own self-interest and so on. And what Hegel lays out in his thinking of the state isn't a kind of any sort of magical guarantee that these things are not going to happen. As he said, we mentioned it earlier, it needs to be known and willed, this whole state organization. And so it's not there by itself as a kind of watches. We just need to have the machine that properly adjusted, and then it will just work fine out of itself. No, we need to continuously want it to be rational and will it and act accordingly. Later on, that's Hegel speaks about habit being like really important in this.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe something else we could talk about is how the individual is meant to remain an individual in the state, because listening to us, someone might think that you're only properly a free or a proper free individual in the state if what you're doing is somehow in service to the universal. And that might seem to undermine individuality, subjectivity. If you're, you might be concerned that it's a very, what's the word?
Well, there is let me start by, or do you have?
No, I can't find the word.
Okay, well then I'll fill in with Hegel's words. So I'll just read from the lectures here, and then I'll add to it. So Hegel writes, quote, "Only in the state do individuals know the universal and are reflected into themselves, have independence. The universal, the laws, stand over against individuals in the state, are posited over against them. Individuals are set apart from these laws. As singular, they are over against the universal. The independence of individuals constitutes the division in the state. The antithesis, this antithesis is the element of rationality, constituting the state as a concrete whole." So on the first kind of pass, yes, the individuals have kind of, by their very nature as individuals, interest that will be misaligned with the state, whose interest is properly the universal. but we shouldn't collapse the two into one or the other extreme, right? Having the state completely be in the service for arbitrary, capricious individual wills, or that the individuals just forego everything about themselves as individuals and just merge into the, the pool of universals. Hegel, it seems that Hegel thinks, no, we need to have this opposition, this difference, this negation, but that the state, in becoming like fulfilled and what he says concrete whole, incorporates this negation, makes kind of a room for the individual's necessary distinction of the universal within it. And I think this kind of follows the concept logic from the science of logic, where the universal out of itself logically progresses into the particular and then into the singular, such that the universal is really the universal fulfilled when we then develop the singular moment, right? And I think there's a lot of the same kind of inspiration or background thinking is at work here as well, with regards to the state.
Yeah. What's interesting from the bit that you read, it's that both, on the one hand, the laws stand over against individuals, and the individuals are over against the laws, the universal. So there isn't this hierarchical conceptual structure. Both in turn stand over against each other, which sets the tension, the opposition. It gives it a very interesting flavor. Normally, you would think that the law stand over and against the individuals, and you wouldn't really think the opposite. Hegel is very wary, I think, of falling into that classic opposition of individuals and state. There is still some kind of tension, as you said. Subjective interest will come up against the interest of the state, which is the universal. But it seems that it's a reciprocal tension. It's a reciprocal opposition. It's one where both have their moment of being above the other. And that seems to me to be subtly different to the classical oppositional view of state and individuals, and the state being over the individuals.
Yes. Yeah, the way I pictured it in my mind is that, okay, we have state on the one side and the individuals on the other, and we have state kind of surrounding both of them, such that the state kind of nests the difference within itself.
That must be the further moment, though. That must be the sublation of this.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the ideal.
That's the good stuff.
That's really good. That's constitutional monarchy stuff.
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that. Yeah.
But he does mention, right, that becoming a functioning member of the state, a citizen, isn't a given affair, as we mentioned earlier, needs to be willed and comprehended, right? So there's work involved on part of the individual to sort of educate themselves, and there is a kind of you have to form the habit, as Hegel writes, of acting in accord with the universal will, of knowing the universal and affirming its purpose, right? So there is renunciation of your particular will to some extent.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
He says fancies and desire do not count. So he says the subjection, just to continue on this topic, the subjection of the will means that the particular will does not count. This does not mean, however, that the individual has no will. Rather, it means that fancies and desire do not count. Thus, what takes place is a working oneself free from the particular will and natural desires. So he's distinguishing almost two levels of subjectivity. One like a superficial level, the immediacy of the passions, maybe we might think of it, where you just do what you feel like doing, or what your instinct propels you to do. And I'm trying to find maybe a quote further down where he actually says it in his words, but I suspect something where an act where your will is in line with the universal, is in line, or it's maybe not in, maybe in line sounds too authoritarian. Maybe one where your will is expressive of the universal.
Yeah, there's also dangers with that, because in the phenomenology, Hegel talks about you have absolute freedom. I think it was absolute freedom, where a certain, the people in charge portray themselves as expressing the universal will, and therefore everybody else must, bow and follow. But Hegel there diagnoses a kind of perversion of how things, well, it's a failure of the state and of objective spirit.
Okay.
So I think we need to do more, right? And one idea I have is that it's which is connecting up with what Hegel says elsewhere about what it means to be ethical, is that you as an individual do not have all the answers. You as an individual may not even be able to comprehend all the answers or to figure it all out on your own. This is the switch Hegel makes from the morality to the ethical proper, is that the moral person is the one who thinks they have all the answers, and that unless they can comprehend the answers or the values, then it doesn't count, it's invalid.
Yeah.
But the ethical one is like submits that, yep, I don't understand everything, but I'm nonetheless, committed to this project, this way of life, my society, and so on. Right. So there's a kind of a renunciation of a sort there.
A renunciation of a certain level of egoism.
Yeah, or humbling, maybe, let's put it like that. A kind of rational humbling.
Okay, so you think when he's talking about freeing oneself from the particular will and natural desires, he might have in mind the kind of stuff you cited from the morality section. This belief that what you take to be good.
No, I think those are two different things, two different stages.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then.
No, my thing about morality was to do with trying to avoid kind of Stalinist party line, kind of dictatorial, authoritarian ways of thinking about the state and freedom. Because I think Hegel's account precisely wants to, avoid all of that. Yeah,
but he also wants to avoid a state where, I imagine you have a cacophony of individuals who present their citizens, not necessarily people in power, but a cacophony of individuals where they present themselves as having the absolute truth or the right idea.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, when he says that individuals have, when he says that this doesn't mean that individuals have no will, I take him to mean the citizens of the state, the average individual.
Sure. Yeah. So all of this makes me think once more of the Gladiator, where Commodus is kind of the ultimate perversion, because the way he thinks of how the state works is that I'm their father and the people are my children. I will just give them love and then everything will be fine. So he's treating it like a family, but it's obviously falls flat. And even the senators kind of like, what are you on, mate? What are you on about?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas what you need is Marcus Aurelius, rationally willing and knowing the state.
Or Maximus, who says, I don't want the head job, the boss position, or I don't want to be in management. I'm happy being mid management and just doing my work well. That's what he wants, right?
Even though, I mean, one wonders, it'd be nice. I mean, they recently mentioned they're going to do Gladiator 2. Maximus obviously won't be in it because he dies at the end of Gladiator.
I am very skeptical about that.
Well, anyway, I'm not going to go into that now. We're not going to
Okay.
digress into that.
No,
But it would be interesting to see, though, because, you know, Maximus is a hero and head of state, politics, very different ball game. Are the virtues of the hero equal to the virtues of, or are the virtues of the hero the kind of virtues you need in being the head of state?
Mhm.
It would be interesting to have seen at least what Ridley Scott thought.
Maybe we can make some sort of response to that later when we discuss the constitution of the state. Because there Hegel goes into a little bit more detail, the relationship between people and government.
Yeah.
Right.
Should we actually move on to that?
Yeah, let's just move on to that. I don't think I have any, unless you have anything else to add in the first section.
No, me neither.
Yeah, well, I guess one thing I could say, something I've just been thinking about, and that is that state might be something like too hard for some people to just like think about, because it's automatically thinks of the government and so on. But another way to think about it is kind of like the largest scale of human organization that we have. That is kind of cohesive within itself. And
so thinking of it in terms of relations instead of institutions.
No, think of it as institutions, right? But not necessarily, as states or nations, because people have hot feelings about those things. But if you strip away the historical and emotional baggage and case things that they may do or have not done, at the end of the day, it's just huge institution, huge organization, right? And it's kind of mediating various different things that is meant to sort of help people function in their day-to-day lives, right? Making sure that people pay taxes, building roads, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So it is like one way to think about it, just like the maximal organizational organ.
I guess one thing, I don't know if we've answered this or if this is the right place to answer this. We've been talking a lot about the universal and the individual's will being in accordance with the universal. What exactly do we mean by the universal? What is it that, because what one concern that one might have is that all this just seems far too conservative, that the fact that you have to work your particular will, natural desires out of the equation might hinder one's ability to notice faults with the state. So what is this universal that we're meant to be knowing and supposedly able to will into actuality? Maybe we don't have to answer it now, but
okay, yeah.
But
I think
that's a big thing.
Yeah, sure. Immediately, on the immediate level, it's just how people behave around one another.
Okay.
Right? They are honest with one another. They're polite. They don't steal from one another. They don't trick one another, right? Because they live in a society where it's just better not to do those things. And you kind of get implicitly rewarded living like that.
Yeah.
So I think on a immersive level, it's a way of life. It's the society you're in.
Is this the aim of the philosophy of right? Partially, to tell us what the universal essence of the state is.
Yes, though we should say that the universal essence here is something, on a conceptual account of it. Sure. Doesn't really say very much about the particularities, although Hegel has some comments on that, right?
Yeah.
But it's a philosophical account first and foremost.
Yeah. So in the philosophy of right, he gives his own philosophical account of what this universal is that we ought to be in accordance with.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I think you can feel it, experience it very emphatically if you go to a different country where, the state is not doing so well, or, they have the security, you see guns everywhere. Like you're going to feel very differently about your day to day going through that kind of environment versus an environment where nobody's walking with any kind of weapons.
Where there seems to be implicit trust between citizens. Yeah. Okay. No, I just wanted to raise that because I thought that might be, for someone who's not very familiar with Hegel's philosophy, that might be a nagging concern.
Yeah.
We've been talking about the universal. We've been talking about being in accordance with it. Well, what is it?
Yeah.
And,
well, it's...
but we can...
Once again, on an individual level, right? It's something that is actually very natural, feels very natural to you. Especially as you're growing up, or have grown up. If you're a kid, it feels extremely unnatural because you have all these instincts and desires and like wanted to grab the world by its throat.
You want to break the state.
Right?
Yeah.
But when you're grown up, it's like, this is just how it is. And you only notice the difference if you go to another place. So this reminds me of our teacher, Professor Houlgate. He used the example when discussing philosophy, right? That he can walk around in Kenilworth or where he lives, like just fine, not having to worry about where he is. But if you go down certain places in Liverpool, certain streets, it's going to be a bit dodgy, a bit sketchy, and you're going to you'll feel that, right? You experience it. So I think that is just a very simple example, manifestation of ethical.
That's a very sort of immediate feeling that this is not the universal at work here, that something hasn't been reached. Is that what the example is meant to illustrate?
Seems that way. Yeah. Okay. I guess you live in a kind of state of nature in Hobbesian terms.
Yeah.
More like that, yeah.
Grim painting of Liverpool, but yeah.
He said certain streets of Liverpool. Or maybe it was Manchester.
Good. Okay then. Okay, so let's move on then to the constitution of the state. Okay. So he does sort of mention a lot of the things that we've already mentioned about different conceptions of the state.
He does make a difference between freedom and free will.
Yeah. Do you want to pick that up?
So in a weird Hegelian way, in the state you give up your free will, but you get your freedom. So what he really means is, once again, the subjective will, where desires, inclinations, or your own self-interest is ultimate. That's the kind of thing that Hegel thinks needs to be educated out of you, because you won't be a functioning member of society. You won't treat others well, and then they won't be treated well in return, kind of deal.
And so that's what freedom is. Freedom is this civil relationship between other members of society, amongst other things. But it's the proper functioning of society in service of the universal.
Yeah, I would say it's a kind of boils down to the way of life, if we want to look at it kind of short and in a nutshell. Because a way of life isn't just something you do as an individual, but it's also connected with others and how they behave and act and the sort of things they do, right? Yeah. So it's all entangled with that. And then freedom, in a place where there is freedom, or more freedom, because there's never zero freedom, there's always like more or less, is nets kind of more opportunities and benefits and possibilities for you as an individual. Right.
Yeah, you might not see it at first when you're getting your natural inclinations educated out of you, but then once you become a functioning member, my God, we sound like terrible people, like putting people into education camps and making them functioning members of society. It's difficult not to make it sound that way.
Yes, we have to go to the education camps.
Yeah, Hegel is he's pro enlightened re-education camps. And then he sort of he picks, we've already mentioned this, but he sort of mentions again another way of thinking about the constitution of the state, which is the opposition between the people and the government.
Right.
And I think very profoundly, he says, as long as this opposition endures, there is not yet, in fact, a state. And I think this is just a very interesting conceptual aspect of Hegel's philosophy, is he has a very clear idea of what a state is. And it's not degrees, it's a very particular kind of conceptual structure. It's what we've already mentioned. And this is the kind of opposition that Hegel seems to be concerned with when he's mentioned, when earlier we talked about the fact that the laws stand over and against individuals and the individuals stand over and against the laws, and they're in this antithesis with it, and they're in this opposition with each other. That's a good kind of opposition, because it's absolute in the sense of being reciprocal.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a bad kind of opposition. This is one where they're both taken to be independent of each other.
Yeah.
And that's not a state. You might think it's a state, but it's not a state.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a kind of malformed perspective of what's going on.
Yeah, it's a form of human organization that I guess it's on its way to the state, but it's not, properly speaking, a state.
Yeah, well, strictly speaking, you wouldn't be able to pick out something as government or as the people without even the state being presupposed.
How would you think of a society where you have an emperor and everyone else is more or less a nobody? Wouldn't that be a kind of opposition of the kind described here?
Sure, but it's still a state.
So that's still a state. Okay.
Still a state, yeah.
So
because there is a fundamental unity where the emperor and his or her family, and then you have the people, and there is kind of some sort of interaction between the two, even though it's like extremely like uneven and whatnot, but still a state, because they're still together in a coherent, or like some sort of whole. Like it's not a coherent whole, because eventually this structure breaks down. There's contradictions within it, in which the structure is through itself unable to subsist. And I think that's going to be the mark of history, which we will get into when we're looking at these various different expressions of the state, is like more states have collapsed than there are states that haven't. Right? Most of our human projects of organizing ourselves have failed, but they've been instructive. We keep trying, and we keep getting better at it.
Yeah.
Up until whatever it is we have now, right? And probably there's contradictions within that is going to be boiling up, and we're going to have to deal with that when it appears.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Hegel's point is actually much more powerful than that. It's, you can't have institutions, and you can't have a society that functions around institutions without it already being a state, and thereby, because it implicitly involves some kind of relation.
Yeah, you wouldn't have any form of ethical life, even in a kind of dystopian dictatorial hellscape.
Right. Yeah.
Because even there is people relating with one another, and it constitutes some kind of twisted whole.
Or there are laws, but the laws just stand more over and against individuals than. Yeah,
and they're just maybe just like various commandments by a individual.
Yeah.
Right. A dictator.
By Robespierre.
Yeah. But I think that it's still a state, even so, as he writes in the philosophy, right? Like a disfigured state is still a state.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
If you really want no state, well, get rid of all the people. Like, actually have no people there. Have like just a dozen people, then maybe you don't have a state. But as soon as you've hundreds, couple of or thousands or whatever, and they're organized in some sort of way, even like a tribal one, okay, maybe a tribal one would be the border case, but yeah,
Maybe.
it's the emergence of the state. It's the police could. The
He says
universal
the
wants
same
to
thing.
get forced. Get out already.
He says the same thing in the logic in the idea chapter.
Yeah,
He says even the worst state is still a state.
yeah.
And his point is, so long as its conceptual structure is out of the idea, it's still a state.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I think that we can also tie this in with the good and evil in some respect, right? Evil on its own just like doesn't exist. There has to be some sort of something minimally good kind of at work in order for the thing to even be there in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Otherwise,
Good. Okay.
it would just completely dissolve. People just run away, do something else, right?
It's just, I think it's just impossible to conceive in a Hegelian worldview of just pure evil. It just wouldn't make sense.
No, yeah. Well, not in the kind of fantastical sense of evil that one might have.
Yeah. So it might help actually to, because we mentioned some like other forms of organization, because Hegel goes on to talk about different organizations of the state. And he sort of gives a very pithy summary of them. So it says the first form is the one in which this totality is still enveloped and the spheres comprising the state have not yet arrived at their independent subsistence, their autonomy.
Right, yeah. So I think like ancient states particularly like emphasize this moment.
Okay.
Compulsory unity. You force
Right.
people into the organization.
Mm-hmm. Good, okay. The second form is the one in which the spheres become free, and along with them, individuals become free too. The first form is compulsory unity, as you said. The second is a loose unity of liberated spheres in which the unity is a secondary factor.
Yeah.
So I guess here we might be thinking of Athenian democracy, maybe the Roman Republic.
Second one which the spheres become free.
And along with them, individuals become free too.
It's hard to say. That already begins to sound modern.
But I think it's important. Maybe if we look at the third one, though, it'll help us to, because Hegel's not being very precise here. Finally, the third form is the one in which the spheres, subsisting independently, find their efficacy only in the production of the universal. So I suspect what Hegel forgot to write in the sentence on the second form is that whilst the individuals are free, they don't find their efficacy in the production of the universal, or solely in the production of the universal.
Yeah.
That must be what's lacking, I think.
Sure, yeah. It would just be kind of too loose, right? It doesn't, it's just gushing forth one direction and doesn't come back.
Yeah, yeah. I'm reading a wonderful book on the Roman Republic now called Rubicon.
Very good.
By Tom Holland.
Sounds excellent.
It is excellent. And I can see this sort of description vaguely. Individuals that are free, but whose efficacy is not solely in the production of the universal. I'm thinking of people like Sulla, the king, the tyrant king, or Crassus or Pompey, or maybe even Caesar. But I think Hegel likes Caesar, so that's interesting actually.
Well, I suppose he was trying to build a state, or it was trying to develop statecraft.
It's interesting
because he is a response to I mean, the Roman Republic was already shot to shit at that point.
Well, it was, yeah. So you've got all these
because you had Marius and you had Sulla. The tyrants were like already coming, right?
Yeah. And then you had Pompey and Crassus, who were basically ruling through, for Pompey, popularity, and Crassus through wealth. What's interesting though is that they're always trying they're always trying to express their motivations as being in line with the virtues of the Republic.
Right.
And this might not even be cynicism. This might be, I think this is something genuine. I mean, the book, I don't want to digress too much into the book, but what seems to be interesting about the Roman Republic is that it validates both traditional notions. So you should always stay true to what Rome is at its core, but also personal ambition.
Yeah.
Both of these things are simultaneously valued.
Yeah.
And it seems that hinders the accordance with the universal. The valorization of personal ambition seems to go against what Hegel puts. It seems to be not only in the production of the universal, it seems to be somewhat in the production of the universal, but also to allow some particular will.
Sure. But then again, he also emphasizes human passion, right? He thinks that passion needs, without passion, anything won't be able to be done, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's something we need to look at, revisit as we throughout the series, because to what extent is personal ambition really detrimental to the universal? Because no personal ambition will get nothing done whatsoever. And I think that Hegel will also admit, even in the conceptual ideal scheme, there's got to be some personal ambition involved in realizing the universal.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's definitely true. Yeah. Definitely something to think about as we maybe go to the chapter on Rome.
But it is interesting you mentioned these two oppositions between veneration of tradition, and so on, and then personal ambition, because they seem at odds with one another, but actually they reinforce one another, right? The traditions get stronger by the up and comer going out and getting what fulfilling their desires and ambitions.
But
and
also
they in turn, okay, go on.
But also you can see how the seeds for the undermining of the traditions are in that unity as well,
right?
Because it just takes one Sulla, one Caesar to misalign their ambitions to then destroy the Republic and to create. But what's interesting about Sulla, I don't want to descend into commentary on this, but what's interesting about Sulla is after he does take over Rome, he's extremely keen to present himself as having done so in accordance with the traditions of Rome.
Right.
So he doesn't want to be a Rex. He doesn't want to be a tyrant. He wants to be a member of the Republic.
Yeah.
So he's trying to show that his actions are in line with the universal.
Yeah.
But to everyone else, it's patently clear that they're not in line with the universal.
Yeah.
And that he is a tyrant.
Yeah.
But then your question comes out again, well, the kind of ambition that Sulla expresses is also fundamental to the Roman Republic. So how do we counter? Does it become?
It's like part of the Times playbook to say, of course, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. It's all in accordance with our society and our values, right?
Yeah,
I have to be dictator.
I mean, I'd be very interested to see what Hegel says about Rome. Actually, maybe this is what the issue with Rome is, with the Republic, that it holds personal ambition on the same level as tradition.
It does seem like a contradiction. That's kind of a collision that's waiting to happen. Yeah. It's a train waiting to get off the tracks, right? Well, this is something that I saw in a documentary, that Carthage, the reason why Rome beat Carthage is because Carthage was overemphasizing tradition and not enough personal ambition. And that the penalty for failing tradition was like execution.
Right.
And so they got shitty generals most of the time, or or like they did things not as well as they could have done. Whereas Rome, like go-getters kind of motivation. Go and get it, boys.
Rome, I mean, this, of course, for all its corruption, for all its nepotism, for all that stuff, which obviously existed, it's also interestingly meritocratic. It's very good at rewarding people who are good for innovative reasons. And that definitely seems to be one of the reasons for its success.
Yeah. Indeed.
But moving on, or rather going back to Hegel,
okay, so after he gave us the recipe of a state with the 3 moments there, he talks a little bit about how these are reflected historically.
Yeah.
And he ends up, like, democracies, he thinks, accidentally crystallize aristocracy within them, right? Or some other, like, they're vulnerable to contingencies. Yeah. And so he ends up with the second kind of kingship and monarchy, which is finally the ultimate and true form of the state.
Yeah.
Well, now, this is a point of contention.
Yeah. This is possibly one of the most awkward bits of Hegel's philosophy of right and world history.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say that Hegel thinks that a constitutional monarchy is the best form of the state, right?
For Hegel?
Yeah.
Seems that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
and the odd thing about it is many of the most well-functioning states today are constitutional monarchies.
Well, yeah, actually, yeah.
So it's like, maybe he's onto something.
So Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, I'll exclude Britain because we're going through a bit of a crisis.
Finland? Does Finland have a king?
No, they don't have one, no.
Oh, okay. My bad.
I think I've named the biggest hitters: Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands. But
and Norway.
Britain, and Norway. Oh,
yeah, we have a king.
Yeah, I'll throw in Britain as well. Just
he's a good lad.
It's definitely something interesting to think about. But in the paragraph after that, he writes, the modern European or Germanic world portrays by contrast the second monarchical constitution, where the particular spheres become free without endangering the whole, where instead the very activity of the particular produces the whole.
Yeah.
What we were talking about before, about producing the universal.
Yeah.
And this is the presentation of the idea, which grants freedom to its different elements, brings them into prominence, and takes them back into its unity.
Yeah. So basically the ideal state is where you don't have this top-down sort of directions, right? You don't have a communist party telling everybody how to behave. They behave well out of themselves, and then this reinforces the whole.
Yeah. It's but what's interesting though is Hegel, I mean, you're making it sound like, I'm not sure if it is if it's meant to be so idealized, right? Because Hegel is perfectly happy to say there need to be laws in the state.
Yes, and the state does have, the right to enforce
that's necessary.
Yeah,
it's not a flaw of the state to have laws. It's necessary for the state to have laws.
So, not just that, but it needs also to enforce those laws, right? Yeah.
And as a little side note, something that I find interesting is that's sort of the mechanical aspect of the state. It's a form of, or at least I think it is, a kind of a form of, to use the words that Hegel uses in mechanism, in science of logic, a kind of violence from one moment to another, which I think has to be couched in mechanistic terms and not in organic terms.
Yeah,
but something I need to think about more. But
yeah,
Nathan Ross, the guy whose book that we like on mechanism,
fantastic guy.
The whole point, excellent. The whole point of his book,
nails it.
He does nail it. Yeah, the whole point of his book is to show how mechanism, the logic of mechanism in the science of logic, finds expression in parts of Hegel's philosophy of right.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting thesis to consider.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah,
There is
so constitutional monarchy. Yeah, so constitutional monarchy, I guess Hegel has the idea of the monarch as the individual point of the state.
Well, let's save the monarch and stuff until later, I think, because
Okay.
I think that we need to qualify it a lot more for it to make sense. Because what certainly Hegel doesn't want a active kind of monarch who is in charge of anything, right? He's thinking more of a kind of formal or symbolic, but not just that either. There is there is some sort of function to it still. But what's really important is the logic of how the particulars and the universal kind of cooperate with one another and reproduce. Right, that the whole is reproduced from the particular.
So I guess what it is that you've got these particulars, which I guess are institutions, and
yeah, but it could also be like interest groups, right? Clubs, religions, right? People forming kind of things together, and they shouldn't have to be, I don't know, persecuted for that, right?
But nor are they in opposition with each other, right? It's in their particular freedoms, they're relating with each other in a way that reinforces the whole. It's not that they're over and against each other in competition for the universal.
Well, no, because then I mean, they're not politically motivated. Let's put it like that. Because they are opposed to one another in terms of like the activity they're doing, right? You can either go fencing or take yoga or go dance, but they're not all the same, right? They don't all love each other, right?
Yeah, sure.
They're different activities.
Yeah. But
and certain
like
groups,
a formal opposition.
I don't know, like if you have a religious group A and then another religious group B, and religious groups A thinks that the world is a agnostic mystic sort of dualism, and the other one thinks something else, and they both hate each other and whatnot, and they according to them it's a real difference.
Yeah, sure. Okay, but that real difference doesn't lead to a fission in the universal. That real difference would be part of the universal.
Depends how they act, I think.
Okay, good.
I think the
Depends how they act.
Currency here for the state is what they do, right?
Okay.
Do they go heckle each other? Do they kind of actively do stuff against each other? Do they stop paying their taxes because of these things, right? So I think maybe the certain threshold where the state engages and not, right?
I think that's a good thing to underline. It depends how they act, because we've seen often so far Hegel emphasizing that history is the domain of actions, not just thoughts. So I think you're very right to mention that.
Really, thought really just becomes noise in the world of history, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what kind of intentions, thoughts, ideals might have had. It's all about the actions and the consequences of those actions. You cross the Rubicon, okay, let's go. It's gonna see what follows from that. You're gonna take over the French Parliament, okay, Mr. Napoleon. I guess you're the emperor now, right?
So what constitutes whether a state is free or whatever is how the people within it are acting. It's not just the ideologies that are bouncing around or what people think it ought to be like or people think it is like, but it's actually on how it's functioning.
Yeah.
On how institutions manifest themselves, what art is expressed, what science is expressed, all this kind of stuff.
Well, art and science, I think they also fall on the wayside. I think the functional element is really important. How people behave, what they do, right? Are they causing unrest? Are they paying their taxes? Are they cooperating? Are they happy? So stuff like that, I think, forms part of what is objective. If you have like huge suicide rate in your country, I mean, that's a problem for the state.
Yeah.
You don't want that. Or the birth rate is too low. Damn, another problem, right? These are things that are could be motivated by certain ideologies or whatnot, right? And that's, I think, when it becomes pertinent to the state.
And that's when you have a particular that is not, what's the word Hegel uses? That does not produce the whole.
Yeah.
I wonder what the German is in that one.
Ganze, I think it is.
No, for produce.
Oh, all right.
I wonder what word he uses.
Produzieren? Isn't that what he uses in the logic? In mechanism?
He maybe, yeah, but I mean, Hegel's not exactly the most precise person with his terminology. Not to take anything away from that great man.
Okay, but I think that's a good place to end it.
I think so, yeah.
I think once again we emphasized the objective element. We have emphasized the external element. I guess the mechanical part of it, right? But it's how does mechanics revolve around one another? What kind of patterns they arrange, and how people come to live, have a world within those patterns, in those structures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe just to bring it back to what we said about the organic conception of the state, it's whether these disparate parts relate to each other organically.
Yes.
In a productive sense. That really.
I think the organic image is striking, because if you really understand it, right? Because we've had kind of fascist politics talking about the body politic and whatnot, but I don't think they really take their own metaphors seriously, because an organic being kind of has all of these different organs, these different kind of things doing different functions, and they all hold each other hostage. If your liver goes, the whole thing goes.
Yeah. Right?
Your kidneys are gone. Yep. Yeah, that's it. All of them have to be there and cooperate with one another for the whole thing to work. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not really extremely dangerous to begin expelling particulars. Right?
Yeah.
I think that's what Hegel kind of wants to convey with the organic metaphor image, is that if you start removing particulars, well, suddenly you might start removing organs, and the whole thing stops working.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, because the organic, because you shouldn't focus on the organism, the totality, when you have the organic. The organic is also the moment of these different moments working in tandem.
Yes.
You shouldn't just zoom out and just see the Aryan race. You should zoom in and see that it's actually a lot of different things that that work together. And I'm just carrying on your lovely fascist critique.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Excellent. Great conversation. And
likewise.
And we'll pick it up next time with the state and religion, art, science, and culture.
Yes. So this will be more part of the sort of noise people produce, but it's also going to have an effect on how people act and behave and so forth, right? So it's not just that the state ignores it completely. And sometimes the state gets obsessed about it, right? As in kind of police states and so on.
Yeah.
So once again, we'll have to figure out, well, what's the rational way to go about these things? Or if there is a rational way to go about these things. We'll see what Hegel has to say.
We will. Okay, then.
Join us next time, people. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.